Hi. So in this video, we're going to be talking about phylum Cnidaria. As you can see, this includes jellyfish, anemone, hydra, and coral. Make sure as you watch that you are taking notes and listening to answer the questions. As always, don't forget you can pause and go back if needed. Okay, so as we begin our notes, it's a good idea to remind yourself what kinds of animals we're talking about. So maybe put down the examples. Remember, we're talking about anemone, coral, jellyfish, and hydra. What all of those have in common is that they are all animals that sting their prey with cells called cnidocytes. So as you're making your notes, it's a really, really good idea to underline or star that. So as we talk about some of the characteristics that they all have in common, one of the first things we can talk about is their body structure. All cnidarian have a similar structure, and that is they have one opening with tentacles. The tentacles aren't used so much for swimming like we would see in some other animals. They're used mostly for prey. Their one opening is called a gastrovascular cavity. The gastrovascular is its name. Gastro, that refers to stomach. Vascular refers to the way that our vascular system is, which is getting nutrients delivered to their body. And so the functions of the gastrovascular cavity is exactly that. Digestion, circulation of nutrients, gas exchange with the water that they're in, and then, of course, support because the gastrovascular cavity fills with water. We'll talk more about that in a sec. Cnidarians are diploblastic, di meaning two, so they have two tissue layers. They have an endoderm and an ectoderm. They lack mesoderm, which is muscle tissue, so cnidarians lack true muscles. They are, however, the first group to have true tissues. Remember, sponges don't have true tissues. Cnidarians are also the first group to have any kind of symmetry. They have radial symmetry. That radial symmetry allows them to be much more advanced than sponges. However, it also limits them. For example, it limits their ability to have a head. They are, of course, mostly entirely aquatic and mostly marine, or mostly living in salted water environments. And they have a great range of how they are able to move. Some, like the jellyfish, are free living and can swim around in their environment. Some, like some anemones and hydra, actually are able to move, even though they, for the most part, don't. I'll show you a cool video about that in class. And then some are sessile, like the corals, which are covered in calcium carbonate, which is a real hard structure. They don't move much at all, so they would be considered sessile. Okay. The polyp would be the sedentary form, so this is the one that looks more like a flower. And the medusa, named after the Greek figure with snakes for hair, is this one that looks like a jellyfish. Here's a good spot to pause, both for notes as well as for some review questions. As we talk about some of the basic body functions of Cnidaria, one of the most notable thing, once again, is that they have radial symmetry. It's a great step up from having no symmetry at all, but it does limit them in that they can't have a head, and so they can't have a central area for a brain or ganglia. So instead they have a nerve net. They do, of course, need to have the nerve net. They move around in their environment, so they need to control that motion. They also need to sense their prey because they are predators. Jellyfish do have a little bit more. They have a ring around the base of their bell. But for the most part, most of them have this nerve net to control their motion and sense their prey. Speaking of motion, they move with contractile cells. So even if the Cnidaria don't move about in their environment, say like a jellyfish, they do have some cells that can move. They're used for hunting. And so they are able to have that movement with a contractile cell. So our muscles move by contracting, and that's how we're able to pull our arm up and out, just by elongating and contracting. The cells work in a similar way, although, like I said, they lack true muscles because they lack mesoderm. Anytime you're going to move, you need to have something to pull your body against. And so that gastrovascular cavity, because it's filled with water, acts a lot like a hydrostatic skeleton we'd see in other invertebrates, like a worm. Speaking of that motion, notice this jellyfish is squeezing its bell, and the water inside of it is providing an opposing force for it to move through its environment. The most important thing about cnidarians, given their name, is that they are predators that hunt their prey with stinging cells. So they use their stinging cells to stun their prey. The stinging cells are called cnidocytes, and they team up with nematocysts, in other words, cells within the cnidocytes. So in the picture, the cnidocytes would be like the yellow structure with this harpoon-like structure inside. And so what's able to happen is that they're able to change the water pressure within their cell and shoot the cnidocyte out super fast and sting their prey. The cnidocytes contain not only poison to sometimes kill their prey, but also some paralytics to help their prey stop moving so that they can take it in, because of course in a chase, jellyfish would never win, and certainly sessile and sedentary animals would not win. Once they're able to subdue their prey, they take their prey into the gastrovascular cavity, and digestive enzymes break down their food. Let's pause here for notes as well as a review question. Reproduction in Cnidaria are like many other organisms in that they can reproduce both asexually and sexually. Asexual reproduction in Cnidaria is mostly through budding. The Cnidaria that exist as polyps mostly are the ones that bud. And remember that budding is just when an organism grows a smaller version of itself that's a genetic clone, and then it pinches off, and in this case it would float away in the water and find a new place to settle and grow up there. Sexual reproduction occurs externally. So the sperm and the egg are released. That's what's happening in this picture down here with the coral. The sperm and the egg are released into the water, and they find each other and get fertilized. After fertilization occurs, there's a larval form, and usually there is some alternation of forms between medusa and polyp, although not all types of Cnidaria alternate like that. We'll talk more about that in a second. Some of them will have a larval stage, as I mentioned, that will actually swim around to find a new location. Others will rely on currents. The ones that have a swimming stage are called a panula. I wouldn't stress about that. It's not something I'm likely to ask you about on a test or a quiz. When you look at some of them, you can see a structure inside that looks, to me, it looks a little bit like a four-leaf clover. Those are the gonads of the jellyfish. Other Cnidaria don't have it quite as obvious to be seen. As I mentioned, sexual reproduction involves a alternation of form. Keep in mind that that's very different than alternation of generation, which we find in plants and fungi. In this case, the only time that the organism is haploid are in the gametes in the sperm and egg right here. The rest of this, after fertilization occurs, is diploid. So it's not at all the same as alternation of generation. So in this case, the alternation of form occurs, again, sperm and egg are released, they find each other, make a larva. The larva then settles down, usually on a hard surface if it's like this particular species, and will grow into a polyp, which will then produce a young jellyfish that will float away. This is just one form of life cycle of a Cnidaria, but it's a pretty common form. Let's take a minute and review Cnidaria reproduction. As I mentioned a number of times, there is a significant variety that exists in Cnidaria, and there are several classes. Remember, it goes kingdom, in this case Animalia, phylum, Cnidaria, and then class. So our classes include Hydrozoa, that would be like the Hydra and the Man-O-War. Hydrozoa alternate between polyp and medusa, though they are mostly in the polyp form. Anthozoa would be like our coral and anemone, so of course they are almost exclusively polyp. Medusa only occur as larvae. With the corals in particular, the corals are covered in a calcium carbonate coating underneath above a soft body, and so that's why they're significantly less mobile. It's also why coral reefs form and build on top of each other, because long after the coral is dead, the calcium carbonate remains. Our next class is Scyphozoa, which includes the jellyfish. They are, of course, primarily in the medusa stage. Their polyp stage is greatly reduced to reproduction. And then we have one more that some don't consider Cnidaria, others group in a different box, a different group, but we'll put them in with the rest of the phylum of Cnidaria, and that is Clubozoa. And the Clubozoa are box jellyfish and sea wasps, also have a primarily medusa form, but they have eyes. The eyes exist are these little red dots. I don't know how well you can see them in this picture, but these little red dots here, and they of course help them sense their prey. As you take notes on all this, it's not terribly important that you get every single detail. Its major body form, whether it's a polyp or medusa, might be something I'd write down. Pause if you need to, and let's take a moment and review. Finally, let's talk a little bit about why Cnidaria are important to both the ecosystem and human beings. So as the picture in the background implies, Cnidaria are crucial for habitats for other organisms. In particular, the corals, of course, are the basis for coral reefs, which are essentially like the rainforest underground. That is, they harbor a tremendous diversity of life, and without the corals, none of that happens. And so keep in mind a couple of things. Number one, keep in mind that corals, as I mentioned, build atop each other, so the only part that's alive is just the top part. Also keep in mind that they are incredibly sensitive. A lot of them are dying at the moment. Unfortunately, the Great Barrier Reef, I think, was just recently considered dead because they're incredibly sensitive to pollution, changes in temperature, changes in light, and they're very easily disturbed by people who are very well-meaning and they want to see it, but stepping on them and walking on them and things like that can disturb them as well. So it's unfortunately a really big shame. In addition to coral reefs, we see that a lot of our surfaces on our coastal areas are covered in not just coral, but anemones and other organisms. They are, of course, a prey species. Lots of organisms eat them, but they are also, of course, predators because they all are predators. They all sting their prey. Corals are used greatly for camouflage, so a lot of the tropical fish we see are very, very brightly colored because the coral are brightly colored. Others will hide in them. You, of course, are probably familiar with Nemo. Here we have a decorator crab you can barely see because it's covered itself in coral. And like I mentioned, the clownfish and the anemone have a tremendous relationship between each other of cooperation, symbiotic relationship called mutualism. And finally, because cnidarians stun their prey and paralyze them, there's quite a bit of research into possibly using some of the chemicals they use to create temporary paralytics for medicine. Let's take a moment and review one last time. That's it for Cnidaria. Make sure, of course, that you get the notes and come to class with any questions that you have.